Hey guys, Arleesha here and welcome to another video. Today we're going to be using some art supplies that I do not like to paint something or someone specifically that I do like very much. So let's talk about the paints first. I am going to be testing out some more art supplies from Arteza, and specifically I'm referring to these metallic acrylic paints. Now I do like acrylic paints very much, but metallic paints are not a thing that I generally enjoy, which we'll talk about in a second. But first I also want to show you this paper. They sent me this acrylic pad paper, comes in a set of 2, and as you can see it has a canvas-like texture to it, and the paper is primed in such a way that you can use acrylics, and it also says you can use oils on the paper. We're not going to be testing oil paints today, but I will be trying it out with these acrylic paints, and I will let you guys know my thoughts on the paper and the paints along the way. So let's talk a bit about metallic paints. I've talked about this a little bit before, but coming into this, I've definitely been of the opinion that metallic paints, in the way that I like to create art, are kind of useless. For me, while I was doing these swatches, which is really supposed to be a pretty relaxing part of a video, you know, swatching, I was just so mad. I was just talking about how useless these paints were, and I'm so glad that you guys can't hear what I was saying while I was swatching these paints. I was just going, you can't even paint metallic things with metallic paints because it makes everything look flat. And I was just, you know, I was saying very impolite things about metallic paints, not necessarily just this brand of paints, because metallic paints are generally pretty similar in that the consistency is not quite as reliable as a standard paint would be, whether you're talking about acrylics or watercolors or gouache. There's always a difference in consistency when it comes to metallic paints because they're just made of different materials and then they're just processed differently. You've got those mica powders and they just don't perform the same way when combined with some sort of binder to make paint. So the color consistency tends to kind of all group together, and that you get paint that's a little bit streakier and a little bit less consistent. So generally in my work, I don't find metallic paints to be very reliable. I think they have a place, especially if your work is more illustrative and you're using metallic paints for accents and, you know, to kind of, I don't know, to kind of get that pop on pieces, then that can be helpful. But I don't tend to be quite as illustrative. I tend to, you know, work a lot with form. I feel like metallic paints can also flatten out a painting, which is why I mentioned not using them to actually paint metallic things. So if you say your character was wearing a gold ring, if you just painted gold metallic paint, it would be a very flat graphic shape. And I use the word graphic specifically because if you are intentionally going for something a bit more illustrative and a bit more graphic, then it can be really useful to have that nice flat gold that shimmers when you shake it and turn it in the light, or however people do that. But for me, I would much rather build my own metallic effect through painting with regular paints and creating highlights and reflective effects with regular paints. It creates more depth that way. So really it just depends on how you're painting when it comes to these. But for me, I generally tend to not like them. And when I do go, I really like how this artist uses metallic paints because there are artists who do beautiful things with them. Whenever I try it, I end up feeling like everything looks super flat, and the shiny effect doesn't do much for me, especially if I want to scan my work, because that metallic shine doesn't transfer into your scan. I was really hesitant going into this, but I wanted to at least give them a fair opportunity and give them a try. And I did like some of the thicker texture of the paint, and I knew that was something I wanted to include later on. As you can see, when I kind of turn these in light, some of the colors are actually shinier than others. Some of those greens and blues and yellowy golds are nice and reflective and shiny in the light, but some of the pinks and purples are a little bit less so. I think it's interesting that there is variety. These paints could also be really useful if you are a crafter or someone who is making postcards or doing hand lettering or things where you might want to have a pop of color, but you're looking for a specific metallic color, so there's some nice variety in the set in that way. Moving on to the actual painting, I'm going to be starting with the paper, the acrylic paper, which is a thing that I'm not super familiar with, so I would like to find more information about how this paper is made, what it's made of, and how it's prepared. If I can, I will leave that information down in the description. But I'm starting with actually regular acrylic paints. I have an Arteza set that I've had for a while now, and I'm just going to be starting with regular acrylic paints and then using the metallic paints at the end for pops of color, and we'll see how it goes. We'll see if by the end, if I like them, or if I don't think I'll use them, if I still feel very strongly against metallic paints as a general thing. But anyway, the person that I'm painting today, I felt kind of silly realizing that I had never painted my husband before, even though we've been together for 12 and a half years and we've been married for almost 9 years. Our anniversary is actually coming up in November, and usually when it gets toward this time of year and I just start thinking about that more and just the progression of our relationship and how grateful I am for him. But I also don't want to spend this entire video talking about how much I love my husband, because it's a lot. Really, really love that guy. But I finally got to paint him, so I'm really excited. I used to draw him when I was in high school because we were dating. We were in a long distance relationship. We lived on opposite sides of the country for several years. So it was really fun for me to draw him occasionally, and we did drawings of each other. He was an artist too. That's actually how we met. And so that's kind of been a little bit of a part of how we've done things always. But I've never painted him before, so it was really difficult trying to take reference pictures of my husband because he's a goofball and he gets silly and maybe a little bit awkward whenever I have to take his picture or whenever I want to take his picture, especially if it's not something super candid where we're out just doing things and taking pictures while we're doing things. But when it comes to actually like, okay, here we are, I need to take your picture, so sit still and don't make a face. He has to make a face. He can't help making a face because he's a cheese. So that was an interesting and strange and difficult experience. And I definitely knew that I wanted to go with something more abstract to paint him. So I wanted a relatively straightforward pose. I took a couple reference photos of him from several different angles and ended up picking this one. And also the sketch that I took off of this board in the beginning of the video is another little sketch I did of him. Doesn't look like him as much as this one ended up looking like him, but it was another angle that I'll probably go back and paint eventually. I've really been enjoying working with acrylic paints. I like that they have a lot of body and texture to them, especially compared with something like gouache, which is a bit flatter and a bit more watercolor-like. I like the opacity and the thickness of acrylic paints and that there's so much variety in that. I'm working with a really simple color palette today. I just have like a scarlet, which is the warmest red in the set, a lemon yellow, phthalo blue, and white. I believe I may have also used a bit of burnt umber to mix with my blues. I really love having a brown to mix with blues to get a nice deep neutral tone that isn't purple, because oftentimes if I don't have a brown, I end up defaulting to purple a little bit more for shadows, and too much purple in a painting is really distracting to me. So having that brown in addition to my primaries and white is really helpful for me in getting more neutralized deep tones. This painting started very pink and very red, which I always love, and there was something about the experience of taking reference photos of my husband and how silly that was, and we were just like doubled over laughing so many times because he just kept making really silly faces, and there was something about just the sweetness of it and the childlike enjoyment of it, even though we're adults and we have jobs and children and stuff. It was just special, and we constantly have experiences like that where we can just make jokes and laugh like we're kids, even though we're not. So there's something of that, I don't know, the innocence and the intimacy and the precious nature of that sort of thing that I wanted to communicate in this painting. And There were little things that technically could have been viewed as mistakes while I was working on this, like the fact that his mouth is a tiny, tiny bit too high and a little bit too small, so his smile looks a little goofy even, and I actually kind of love that. I can't even say why, but I do. I kind of love it. Right here was where I jumped in with the metallic paints. So I mostly wanted the metallic accents to just be super subtle things that would shine in the light and also not flatten out my painting, which was actually a nice benefit to having so many different color options as opposed to just a gold or a silver. I was able to kind of use the colored metallic paints to complement the colors that were already in the piece. And I even mixed some of the reddish pinkish one with some of my regular yellow paint, the non-metallic paint, to create something a bit orangey for certain areas. And it was okay. It worked out all right. I wasn't super angry about it. And this was actually the next day, and I was feeling like there just wasn't enough metallic paint, especially because the purpose of this video was to kind of push myself and use a supply I normally don't like. So I went back in with one of the pearl colors and just put that pearl color over the entire back white rectangular area behind his face. And I really loved the texture of it. I loved that I could see all of my brush strokes, and it was just so pleasing to look at. This paper actually performed really nicely, especially for practice things. It warped a little, but once it was dry, it flattened out a lot. And I'm definitely going to be using tons more of this paper for practice paintings like this one. And when I took it off my panel and I was looking at it and kind of bending it in the light, I didn't hate it, actually. I felt like I was able to use the paint in such a way that it didn't just flatten out what I was working on, especially because we can see the brush strokes in that pearl area, so it creates some nice texture and nice depth. And the metallic accents within the painting, I liked, actually. So I'm going to be using more of this metallic paint. Not all the time. It's not going to become a staple for me, I don't think, but I liked it way more than I thought I would, for sure. So if you guys are interested in checking out any of these products, I'll leave links down in the description as always. Thanks for listening to me ramble about my husband for several minutes. I hope you guys are all doing very, very well, and I will see you next week. Okay, bye. Bye-bye.